Like,
okay, guys, we're gonna get started tonight. So tonight we are going through the story of Esther. That we've been reading in the book, the story.
You have it pulled up.
And so we're gonna start out with a video tonight that summarizes the whole thing. So.
Esther's story takes place during the years of the Jewish exile, around 470 BC. Now the Jews had been defeated by Babylon, which meant they were exiled from their homeland and taken as slaves. But later, the Babylonians were defeated by the Persians. So now, the Jews found themselves under the rule of the Persian king, Xerxes. That's where our story begins. King Xerxes decided he was going to throw a party. And this wasn't your standard cookies and punch type of party. This party lasted for 7 days and included all manner of lavish feasting and drinking. Now on the last day, the king decided to show off his queen, who was very beautiful. But when he called for her to come to the feast, she refused. This greatly angered the king, and not only the king, but his counselors and noblemen as well, because they were thinking, if the queen treats the king this way, wives everywhere are going to start disrespecting their husbands. They're going to be mouthing off, refusing to change the baby, they're not going to cook the falafel for dinner, it's going to be chaos. So the king declared that the queen was no longer the queen, which meant that he needed to find a new one. Now, if you're an all-powerful male in the ancient world, what better way to find a new wife than to parade every beautiful single woman in the land through your palace? So that's what he did. Among the hundreds of women sent to the palace was a girl named Esther. Esther was secretly a Jew, and she was also an orphan raised by her uncle Mordecai. And though she was essentially the lowest possible social class, the Lord was with Esther, and she was a beautiful and graceful woman. When she was brought to the palace, she found favor among all the king's staff, and ultimately the king himself, who chose her to be queen. Sometime later, Esther's uncle Mordecai was sitting at the city gate when he overheard 2 men plotting to kill the king. Mordecai quickly relayed this to Esther, who told the king, who promptly solved the problem. Even though he saved the king's life, Mordecai was never recognized for what he did. And sometime later, he found himself in trouble when a man named Haman rose to power. Haman was the king's second in command, and whenever Haman walked through the streets, everyone was ordered to bow down before him. But Mordecai, being a Jew and a follower of God, refused to bow to Haman. When Haman found out about it, he was enraged. In fact, he was so enraged that he plotted to kill not only Mordecai, but every single Jew in the empire, women and children included. By Haman's influence, the king sent out a decree that ordered all Jews to be executed and their property taken. When Mordecai found out about it, he begged Esther to approach the king and ask him to change his mind. But Esther knew that if she were to approach the king without being summoned, she could, by law, be put to death. Esther was in torment, but finally, after much fasting and praying, she decided to approach the king, even if she should perish. When the king saw her standing before him, he loved her and invited her to speak. "What do you wish, Esther?" the king asked. Esther replied, "I would ask that the king and Haman come to a feast that I shall prepare." The king was delighted, as was Haman, and together they feasted. Toward the end of the meal, the king asked Esther, "What is it that you wish? Anything you want will be granted to you, up to half my kingdom." Esther replied, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come to another feast that I will prepare, and there I will answer the king's question." Haman left the palace happy that day, but on his way home, he noticed Mordecai at the gate, and was reminded of Mordecai's refusal to bow to him. Haman's mood darkened. He decided to have a gallows built, on which Mordecai would be hanged the following day. That night, the king couldn't sleep. So he ordered the book of records to be brought and read to him. When the account of Mordecai's warning of the plot to kill the king was read, the king asked, "What have we done to honor Mordecai for saving my life?" "Nothing, your majesty," replied the servant. So the king called for Haman, and when he arrived, the king asked, "What should I do for someone I want to honor?" Haman thought he was thinking of him, and he said, "You should put your royal robes on him, and a crown, and let him ride your horse through the streets so that everyone will know that this is the man the king honors." The king thought that was a great idea, and he said, "Perfect! Go and get Mordecai and do exactly what you have just said. In fact, you can be the one to lead the horse around." Soon after this, the day of Queen Esther's feast arrived. After they had finished eating, the king again asked Esther, "What is it that you wish?" "Anything you want will be granted to you, up to half my kingdom." Esther replied, "O king, if it please you, all I ask is that my life and the life of my people be spared. For I am a Jew, and it has been decreed that all Jews in the empire should be annihilated." When he heard this, the king was furious. "Who would do such a thing to my queen?" he shouted. "Haman," replied Esther. "And furthermore, he has built a gallows to hang Mordecai, who once saved the king's life." The king replied, "Then let Haman be hanged on it." And so it was. Haman was executed on the gallows. And a new decree was issued, saving the lives of the Jews. Esther and Mordecai were honored and spent the rest of their days serving the king.
I thought that was kind of fun. Okay, so how many of you, when you can't sleep at night, want the book of records read to you? Alright, so that's the story of Esther. If you want to go more in depth, it's a really short book in the Bible, so read up on it. How many of you know the story of Edna in the Bible? Do you know the story of Edna? Okay, that's right, because Edna didn't make it into the Bible because Esther did what she was told. So tonight we're going to be talking about obedience. That's why we kind of went with the game and everybody following what the leader was doing. And so we're going to start out by talking about obedience. So if you open your Bibles to Esther chapter 4, verse 14. Here I'm going to
Okay. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die.
Okay. All right, so I think that there are several lessons that we can learn from Esther, and so we're going to talk about two things tonight. And the first one is about God's presence and how whether we see or don't see God, He is at work in our lives. And so I missed church this weekend, but I heard that Pastor Rick spilled the beans. But did you guys know that God is not mentioned once in the book of Esther? And neither is prayer. So they do talk about fasting, but they never talk about God or prayer in the book of Esther. But obviously she knows that there is some higher power. She knows that we need this message and this deliverance from God. And so that's why she goes into, and it's in verse 4:16. We're going to read it here after a little bit. But she talks about fasting. And it's really her way of getting direction from God. And she knows she can't do it on her own, but it just kind of opens her up for some spiritual growth. Okay, so the verse that we came up with on this one is Philippians 4:6. So if somebody can find it, and then rush up here and have you read it for us.
Audrey,
You get to stand on stage with us. 4:6.
Don't worry about anything, instead pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank Him for all He has done.
And I think we probably all know about that verse. We've probably said it. It might be on a wall somewhere. But I think if you really take that to heart, Esther didn't all of a sudden start fretting. She just said, okay, fast for me. Me and my maidens are going to do the same thing. And in, I think it's 3 days, then we're going to come back and we're going to reevaluate, right? So she was relying on God. Okay, so the second part of knowing that God is still working in our lives is to know that God has a plan for your life.
Okay, so the first question is, are you doing what God is calling you to do? Because I know that a lot of times you know that you're supposed to do something, but you don't because you feel like, oh, if I do this, then I won't fit in here. But Esther knew that if she did this, she was going to either die or be accepted by the king, and that's a 50-50 chance depending on his attitude that day. So that was her options. So God loved the Jewish people, and he didn't just make Esther beautiful and graceful for no reason. He made her like this so that the king would find favor in her, so then she would be able to save his people from Haman, who, in this case, the story is the bad guy.
Okay, so we're going to look at Jeremiah, verse 29:11. And it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope." And even though, this is a prophecy, I think it speaks not just to that one person, it's speaking to all of us. So God has a plan for each one of our lives. It's not necessarily, oh, well, Esther was beautiful and she was made queen, so of course there was a plan. No. God has a plan for each one of us. If Allie doesn't listen tomorrow and she's supposed to talk to one of her friends and she's like, I don't want to look a fool, and walks on, what happens to that friend? They're not friends, right? So there could be a lot of consequences. Okay, our third point on this is that we are given divine moments to alter circumstances, and what that really means is that God gives us time that we can make changes. And I think as believers, we need to realize that things don't happen on accident. It's not really a coincidence, I didn't just happen to come exercise at this church and meet Reg and fall into youth group. I don't think it was a coincidence. It didn't all just happen, but there was this big plan. And so I think if you look at your life, you can find some pretty specific examples. I know Caitlin came to youth group because somebody else had the courage to ask her to come. So there's a whole lot of things that it's not just accidental that you're put into those places. And so in Esther's timing, she wasn't exactly the best choice for queen. She was a Jew. There was already a queen. So do you guys know how the queen really got kicked out? Right, so they were having this big feast, and the king wanted Queen Vashti to come through and basically parade in front of all of these drunken men, and she refused. And so he said, you refuse me, you're out. Finding somebody new. But if that wouldn't have happened, Esther never would have come into the picture. And so all of these things just start to line up.
So, we need to stand with courage because, anyways. We need to stand with courage because, honestly, that was one of the most courageous things that Esther ever did in her life, was when she decided that it was time to go talk to the king and put her life on the line. And I think it's on the slide, if I wanted it, but it's, if I perish, I perish. And I'm going to talk about what Rick said at church this weekend. He said, you might not physically die, but you might die to some people. And, it's okay. Because, if you perish to this group of people and they don't want to be around you anymore, that might lead you to go find another group of people that does need you and that will listen to you, and you might end up, helping some people out. So, yeah. Who wants to read Esther 4:16. Find it.
Okay, can you actually look at the flip space go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same, and then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, then I must die.
Okay, so before our second point, we've got a quick video again.
Feels like I've been holding my breath, trying to steal my restless heart. Everything hangs on my next step, finding my nerve, playing my part. I found shelter underneath his crown, found favor inside his eyes. Rock this boat and I just might drown. Honesty seems to come with a price. There's a time to hold your tongue, time to keep your head down. There's a time, but it's not now. Sometimes you gotta go uninvited. Sometimes you gotta speak when you don't have the blood. Sometimes you gotta move when everybody else says you should stay. No way, no, not today. You gotta ask if you want an answer. Sometimes you gotta stand apart from the crowd. Long before your heart could run your risk. You were born for this. Hey, you were born for this. I'm leaning on the ones before me, my father's dreams. I'm standing on the top of the shoulders, calling the one delivering me. There's a time to hold your tongue, time to keep your head down. There's a time, but it's not now. Sometimes you gotta go uninvited. Sometimes you gotta speak when you don't have the blood. Sometimes you gotta move when everybody else says you should stay. No way, no, not today. You gotta ask if you want an answer. Sometimes you gotta stand apart from the crowd. Long before your heart could run the risk. You were born for this. Yeah, you were born for this. One step, one move, born to trust you. Made to lay my life before you. So I gotta go. Sometimes you gotta speak when you don't have the blood. Sometimes you gotta move when everybody else says you should stay. No way, no, not today. You gotta ask if you want an answer. Sometimes you gotta stand apart from the crowd. Long before your heart could run the risk. You were born for this. 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 You were born for this.
Okay. So I really like those words. The whole, no way, not today, I'm not going to stay. A lot of times we're stepping out in faith, and we may not always know exactly where we're headed, but that's what faith is doing it. Even though we have absolutely no idea where we're going or what we're doing, but we know that that's what God has told us to do. And I think the big part here is knowing that God's timing is always right. And sometimes he says, go, now. And sometimes he says, wait. In Esther's story, we see that he gives her a lot of preparation time. When the queen is thrown out and they start parading all these women through, it doesn't happen the next day. They go out and they find all of the beautiful women in the kingdom, and for a year, they are put through these beauty treatments. Use your imagination, right? Oils and myrrh, and I can imagine them being scrubbing down with pumice stones, and it's like the whole Hunger Games thing, so.
Wow.
But if you think about it, I mean, that's something that we see in our culture, if you've seen that set of movies, and we don't think anything of it. Oh, they're getting ready to go into this competition. Well, God is getting us ready for something every day. And so God is not just saying, hey, she needs to be more beautiful. He's refining us. And it may be exterior. It's probably more so going to be interior. He's changing our character.
So it's kind of hard, to use a proud person. So, God normally basically doesn't use them. Because if you are working with a prideful person, they're not going to do what you want them to do. They're going to think that they're right and then not listen to you. And, you can't jump out before the time is right. Because a lot of times you're like, oh, this is taking forever. But, if Esther would have done that, then she would have came up with a lot of problems, and then the Jewish people might not have been saved in the way that they were. The entire book of the Bible wouldn't be named Esther. And, yeah. Okay, who wants to read Esther 2:12? Go. Hurry up.
And if somebody else wants to find Acts 1:7 and come up right behind them, so we kind of put these 2 points together. Okay, so this is Esther 2:12.
During the year before each young woman's turn to go to King Esther's, what is that? Whatever that guy's name is. Xerxes? The hard regulation required her to receive beauty treatments with oil of myrrh for 6 months, and then with perfumes and cosmetics for another 6 months.
And Acts 1:7.
He replied, the Father alone has the authority to set those dates and times, and they are not for you to know.
Okay, so I think the third part of knowing that God's time is right, so we've got to prepare. We need to wait for his timing. If he says wait, wait. If he says go, do it. But we need to make sure that we've got God's favor. That's the third part. And I think when we lead this life that's pleasing to God, when we're obedient to him, when we choose to be holy and set apart and look differently, God is going to bless us. And I think it's a whole lot easier to hear what he's saying if we have that close relationship. So I know a lot of times we talk about prayer and we talk about worship, we talk about reading our Bible. That's how we get to know God. It's not like I can take him to coffee like I do Kara. But when we read his word, or when we can pray with him and we worship him, we have this close relationship, and it just pulls us closer. And it's just like your best friend. If Jen says something from across the room, I can pick her voice out. I spend time. If I don't ever pay attention to somebody and all of a sudden they're yelling my name in the back of the room, do I hear them? And if I hear them, do I listen?
So disobedience leads to separation, and we see that a lot with Israel, because they go through a time where they're following God and they're doing all the right stuff, and then they start to fall away, and then they start to disobey, and then they start to get separated, and then God pulls them all back together, and then they do it all again. And this is kind of if she disobeyed, God would have used someone else, but then the story would be completely different. So she stepped out in faith and did something that at that time would have been really hard to do, and she accomplished a really hard task because she relied on God to get through it. Okay, another verse. Romans 5:18 through 19.
Consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people. For just as through the disobedience of many were made sinners, so also through the obedience of the one man the many will be made righteous.
So this is comparing and contrasting Adam and Jesus. So when it talks about how the one man sinned and it made the rest of the people sinners, that's through Adam and Eve, that it passed through all of humanity. But with the birth of Jesus and through his life and resurrection, we have been made whole again. And through his obedience, we have again found favor with God, because without that, we have this big separation, and there can be no favor.
Okay, so with that, like, Adam's decision to sin made us all sinners. So, like, what do your actions do to other people? So, like, if you decide that you're going to be really rude to your teacher, then that's really going to probably put them in a bad mood, and then that's going to affect all your classmates that had to go after you. And then it's also going to, like, really affect your teacher because you're being rude to them. So, like, what you do does have consequences, and that's either good or bad. And in Esther's case, it was good because all the Jewish people got saved and all their enemies got killed. But in like the opposite way, Haman was plotting against the Jewish people, especially Mordecai, and he had this giant gallows set up to kill Mordecai on, but he got killed on it instead. So, like, yeah.
Okay, and then I think the last point is what holds most of us back, or at least this is what holds me back. But I think it's really important that we remember that who we are doesn't stop God from using us. One of my favorite quotes is, God doesn't call, he equipped. He equips the called. I love that. And I think what that means is that if God calls you to do something, if you are obedient enough to step out in faith, it doesn't matter if you think you have the skills or not, God will provide it. He provides the people, he provides the resources, he gives you the wisdom. And if he asks you to do something, as long as you're stepping out and following him, it's going to fall into place. Esther was an orphan. She was a Jew. She was a she. Those are all three things against her, So we've got this orphaned Jewish girl growing up in the Persian kingdom, not even in her own area. They're not supposed to worship their own God. Her family is being plotted against by the king's second in command. It doesn't look good. And she could have easily have said, but who am I? And instead, when she's called up, she goes through the treatments. She goes through the process of being paraded through the king's court. She becomes one of his women, one of his concubines, and eventually the queen. And I think it's really important that we kind of look at that and we know where we come from doesn't determine where we're going to end up. And what does determine that is your faith.
Okay, so God is in control of literally every aspect of our lives, and like we need to be like Esther and be like, if I perish, I perish. Just take that leap of faith, and God will provide. So, yeah, the best thing we can do is surrender to His will, and it'll lead to glorification in the end of God, not yourself. Okay. Okay. Let's find Hebrews 13:21.
Oh my gosh, I have it. You go.
All right, Miranda.
No, it's okay.
Okay, Lucas, come on. I love that you guys are fighting over fighting it.
May He equip you with all you need for doing His will. May He produce in you through the power of Jesus Christ every good thing that is pleasing to Him. All glory to Him forever and ever. Amen.
I think what's really important in that verse is that it does talk to us about equipping us, but at the very end it says, and then glorify God. And we can't forget that. If we're given the special talents, and we just use it for our own personal glorification and, oh, I'm so much better than you at, are we using that talent for what it was meant? And so I think it's really important that we turn that back and we use that for God's glory, but remember to also point it towards